Within just a couple of weeks, the Detroit Pistons have gone from completely unwatchable to must-watch TV as they approach the most historic losing streak in NBA history. The shared consensus for a while now has been that the 2024 draft class isn't going to be a great one. In a year where there's not really much to lose for, the Detroit Pistons are losing in a way that we've never seen before, currently on pace to win only 5 games. In this video, I'm going to break down how the Pistons got here and how they could potentially turn it around. In the past 13 seasons since 2009, Detroit Pistons have made the playoffs twice. And in those 2 playoff appearances, they didn't win a single game. Their best season was in 2016 when they won 44 games. Every other season since 2009 until now, they haven't even had a winning record. But the interesting thing is, when you look back at their recent history, there isn't really 1 or 2 terrible moves or 1 really bad contract that you can point to that got them here. It's just been a compilation of small marginal moves that weren't great, combined with a lack of chemistry, roster construction, and what I really think is a lack of player development. The Pistons have 9 former lottery picks on their roster today, but not a single one that's ever made an all-star team. Now let's take a look back at how they've gotten here. Leading the charge in Detroit is general manager Troy Weaver. But who is he? Well, before Troy Weaver joined Detroit, he spent time building up his resume with both Utah and OKC. He was the head of scouting for the Utah Jazz in the mid-2000s, when they drafted Darren Williams with the 3rd overall pick in 2005, and when they drafted Paul Millsap with the 47th overall pick in the 2006 draft. That one was a really good find that late in the draft. From 2008 to 2020, Troy Weaver worked with OKC as vice president and assistant GM. One of his most notable moves was in his first year with the franchise, pushing the rest of the front office to select Russell Westbrook with the 4th overall pick of the 2008 draft. When just a month earlier, some draft boards actually had Westbrook projected at the end or even outside the lottery. We all know Westbrook for being the former MVP, multiple-time All-Star, and triple-double machine, but before he got to the NBA, Westbrook was only a 3-star recruit in high school and only averaged 8 points per game over his 2 years with UCLA. So although these gems were a bit in the past, coming to Detroit, Troy Weaver had a bit of a reputation of being able to find a diamond in the rough. Let's take a look back at how that's translated over his time with Detroit so far. In his 4 drafts with the team, these are the players that the Pistons have drafted in the first round. In 2020, the Pistons drafted Killian Hayes with the 7th overall pick. And via trade, the Pistons also landed Isaiah Stewart, who was the 16th overall pick, and Saddiq Bey, who was selected 19th overall. In 2021, the Detroit Pistons had the 1st overall pick when they drafted Cade Cunningham. In 2022, the Detroit Pistons drafted Jaden Ivey, 5th overall, and drafted Jalen Duren, 13th overall. And then in the most recent draft in 2023, the Detroit Pistons drafted Asar Thompson with the 5th overall pick. Now, revisionist history can always make mistakes seem obvious when looking in the rearview mirror. But looking back at the last 3 drafts that the Pistons have had, they haven't actually done that bad of a job. What's really hurt them, however, was that in Troy Weaver's first year in the 2020 draft, when they had 3 players selected in the top 20, they missed out on a lot of gems. The Pistons missed out on players such as Tyrese Halliburton, Devin Vassell, Tyrese Maxey, Desmond Bane, and Emmanuel Quickley. That definitely set them back a bit. Well, what about the trades that they've made? Well, in the last 3.5 years under Troy Weaver's control, Pistons have made 22 trades. Most of them have been pretty minor, but here are some of the notable ones. In 2020, the Detroit Pistons traded 4 second-round picks, Bruce Brown and Luke Kennard, for 1 second-round pick and Saddiq Bey. 3 seasons later, they ended up trading Saddiq Bey for James Wiseman. Now, neither Saddiq Bey or James Wiseman has better than a 30% winning percentage. Meanwhile, Bruce Brown and Luke Kennard both have a 53% winning percentage over their careers. As we know, Bruce Brown went on to win a championship as a key rotation piece for the Denver Nuggets, then was a highly coveted free agent that went on to sign a pretty big contract with the Indiana Pacers last offseason. Luke Kennard hasn't had the same success as Bruce Brown, but he's also found a role in the league as a rotation player who's contributed to winning. He signed a 3-year, $41 million extension a month after being traded from Detroit, and that same season, Luke Kennard would advance all the way to the conference finals with the Los Angeles Clippers. Both are key pieces that probably could have helped the Pistons. In July 2022, they traded Jeremy Grant to Portland for insignificant draft capital. And then in September of 2022, Pistons traded away Kelly Olynyk and Saben Lee for for Bojan Bogdanovic. The Bojan Bogdanovic trade was actually pretty good. But what I'm seeing here is that they're losing around the margins and not trading their assets at the ideal time. They definitely traded Bruce Brown too early, and you could probably make the same argument for Leonard as well. They probably should have retained Sadiq Bey instead of chasing the James Wiseman experiment, and it would have been nice if they could have also flipped Jeremy Grant to contender and maybe gotten back either a young piece or a more tangible asset than the draft capital that they got in return. Looking back, you wouldn't necessarily point to any of these trades and say that trade was catastrophic, but you also can't point to any of these trades and say that they received a significant foundational piece or significant draft capital that will help the Pistons get back to the playoffs. What about the signings that they've made under Troy Weaver's control? Well, in their first offseason back in 2020, they had one of the more confusing offseasons where they kept trying to acquire big men. We saw the Pistons sign Jeremy Grant to a 3-year, $60 million sign-in trade, and then they also drafted Isaiah Stewart, they signed Jahlil Okafor, and they also signed Mason Plumlee. They have had some positive signings as well. Just last season, we saw them sign Bojan Bogdanovic to a 2-year extension, which was pretty solid. However, again, they kind of missed the window on when to trade him when his value was highest. They probably should have traded him at last year's trade deadline, where we could have seen them acquire a first or maybe 2 first-round picks for him. Whereas now they'll probably look to trade him at this trade deadline, but his value has kind of diminished from what it was a year ago. This past summer, we also saw the Pistons sign Isaiah Stewart to a pretty reasonable 4-year, $60 million rookie extension. That could definitely be a pretty tradable asset in the future. Another signing that they made this past offseason, which was a little bit surprising, was when they went all in on head coach Monty Williams. They signed Monty Williams to a 6-year, $78.5 million contract that could escalate all the way up to 8 years and $100 million with incentives. At the time, this was the largest contract for a head coach in NBA history, now only second to Greg Popovich. Looking back now, it's easy to question why would the Pistons invest in signing Monty Williams to a record-breaking contract. Well, at the time, the Detroit Pistons weren't a very desirable location for probably any head coach. And at the time, Monty Williams was the winningest coach since 2021 till the time that he was signed. And also he had made the playoffs for 3 of the past 4 seasons with the Phoenix Suns. So the Pistons made an investment in what they're hoping is someone that can help create a winning culture. It hasn't happened yet, but we're still only about 30 games into the season, so it's still early. So now that we understand who they've drafted, who they've traded, and who they've signed, what's next for the Pistons? The problem is, despite having 9 former lottery picks on their roster, they haven't been able to develop a single one of them. Since 2009, the Detroit Pistons have had 10 lottery picks, but they've only had 1 player that they drafted and then developed into an all-star, and that was Andre Drummond. They need to address this problem, because if they can't develop players, it doesn't matter how many lottery picks they have, they won't turn this thing around. And they also won't be able to flip these players into future assets either, because they haven't raised the value of these players enough. Once they address this development problem, they need to figure out a timeline by which they think they can realistically become competitive. Now, Monty Williams can afford to be patient. He may not be in a huge rush because he just signed a 6-year contract. However, general manager Troy Weaver, he's been around for about 3.5 years, and he may find his back against the wall and the pressure building a little bit. If Troy Weaver is working on an accelerated timeline, I think realistically 2 years is the quickest that the Pistons could turn things around and become a play-in team. That would be the 25-26 season, the first year that Cade Cunningham's rookie scale extension would be on their books. So let's summarize now the steps that the Pistons would need to take to get back to winning. Step 1, develop their players. They have way too many former lottery picks that haven't developed into all-stars. It's time for them to figure out which players can take the next step. Step 2, move their assets while they still hold value. 1, Bojan Bogdanovic, he still has 2 years, $39 million with only 2 years, $2 million guaranteed next year. That's their best trade chip. They have to find a way to maximize the value on Bogdanovic's contract. They also have Monty Morris's $9.8 million expiring contract, as well as Alec Burks' $10.5 million expiring contract. Ideally, they would try to send these players to a team like Oklahoma City to try to fetch multiple picks in return. Step 3, even though it's a weak draft class, they have to hit on the player that they select at the top of the 2024 draft. They absolutely cannot afford to miss on that player. Step 4, go into the offseason with about $55 million of cap space and look to add rotational pieces. You don't need to find a star, you need to build a foundation to attract a star later, or hopefully you can develop a star and you already have the foundation around them. Step 5, address your shooting problem. Pistons are currently 30th in 3-point percentage, and in the modern NBA, that's just not a recipe that's gonna lead to winning. Step 6, during the 24-25 season, find out which players of the ones that you've acquired or drafted fit well with Cade Cunningham and which players don't. And the players that don't fit well next to Cade Cunningham need to be traded while their value is still high. That way you can go back into the 2025 offseason with significant cap space yet again. This will likely be the last offseason where the Pistons have significant cap space, because after that, they're going to sign Cade Cunningham to his rookie scale extension, which is going to start at around $40 million. And after that, some of their other young players are going to start becoming extension eligible as well. Step 7, realistically, Detroit's going to have a high draft pick again in 2025, which is supposed to be a much stronger draft class. And hopefully they can land their franchise corner piece, maybe a player like Cooper Flagg, which would eventually allow Cade Cunningham to become their second best player. And that is going to be their best chance of turning this thing around and becoming a playoff team once again.